Hey, how's it going guys? Captain Cuba here, and the day is finally here. After many requests from you guys, I've decided to rank all the God of War bosses from worst to best. I already have a list of my top 10 bosses, but even my opinion on those have changed a little bit, and I've also never made a top 10 worst bosses video. So with this video, I get the two topics out of the way once and for all. Now I want to clarify that I will not be ranking these characters based on how powerful they are. I'll only be ranking these bosses based on how much fun these fights were to fight the first time I played the game. But if you still want to know my opinion on which are the most powerful characters in the God of War series, you can click on this link and it will take you right to it. So with that out of the way, grab some popcorn, sit back, and enjoy this God of War nerd rant about boss fights without a script.
Don't you know when to give up?
Alright, so the worst boss battle in the entire God of War series would have to go to the BALDUR mountain fight. And first of all, I'm not even sure if I can consider this a boss fight. Literally all you do is get on a dragon, punch Baldur a few times, dodge a few of his moves, and that's it. I have to include it because there's still some gameplay in it, but this is pretty much, this is only a glorified quick time event. If that. So obviously the worst one would have to be this one. For number 46, I'm gonna have to go with ICARUS. This fight suffers the same issues as the Baldur mountain fight. All you do is punch ICARUS down a cliff, and then rip his wings off. The reason it's slightly better than the Baldur mountain fight is because you actually do get to kill ICARUS. But other than that, it's not really impressive. It's another glorified quick time event. For number 45, I'm gonna have to go with GULLVEIG. And I mean, is there any doubt that GULLVEIG should be this high up as one of the worst battles in the series? Should it even be considered a boss fight? I'm not sure. This is just a reskin of the Revenant enemies. I'm assuming Santa Monica just didn't have enough time to create a boss battle for the side missions. But this was just completely disappointing. For 44, I'm gonna have to go with the mole CERBERUS. The only reason I'm adding this is because when I go to the God of War 2 wiki, it's considered one of the boss fights. But once again, it's just another CERBERUS. For number 43, I'm gonna have to go with HELIOS. HELIOS is slightly cooler. It's another glorified quick time event, but it's just very memorable just ripping his head off. And there's also this mechanic in which Kratos has to block the light coming from his face, and you have to use the right joystick to block the sun, and it's a much more fun mechanic, but again, it's another glorified quick time event. For number 42, I have DEIMOS. DEIMOS is another one of those boss fights that I'm not sure if it's a boss fight, because, I mean, you fight him, but you know deep down that Kratos is not gonna kill him because he's an important character. And then you fight him for like 3 minutes, and then he beats you to a pulp, and then Thanos just picks him up again. That's really it. I wasn't really expecting much, but it's still slightly better than HELIOS. For number 41, I'm gonna have to go with the Dark Rider. I'm in the minority of people who actually like the Pegasus section of God of War 2. I thought it was a pretty fun section, and finishing it off with the Dark Rider was pretty fun. It's not the greatest boss fight ever. All you do is just dodge his projectiles, and then get on his griffin, and then kill him with the Spear of Destiny. But it was still somewhat memorable. For number 40, I'm gonna have to go with SCYLLA. SCYLLA is easily the worst intro boss fight in the entire series. Literally all you do is hit her tentacles, then kill her crabs, and then she disappears. And then 30 minutes later, you see her again and you kill her by doing a quick time event, by stabbing her in the eye with one of those screwy things in the caves. It's just really lame, I'm sorry. I love Ghost of Sparta, but that intro boss fight just sucks. For number 39, I'm gonna have to go with the Dark Elf King. Again, I expected a lot more from the Alfheim level, and this boss battle did not deliver at all. The Dark Elf King behaves exactly like the other Dark Elves, at least that's how I remember him. There's nothing really special about him that sets him apart from the other enemies. He's just a very lame boss fight. He does get some redeeming points at the end by, hinting at the future of the series by telling us that, we've made a grave mistake, but that's not really part of the mechanics or anything like that. It's just a cool thing he says at the end. But the boss fight itself was just really disappointing. For number 38, we have Theseus, Zeus's #1 kiss ass.
Let alone the king of Olympus.
The reason this guy ends up so high in the list is because he's not really that fun. There is a few more mechanics to him. You have to learn his patterns a little bit, and he does get on top of the temple and shoot some projectiles, but he loses a lot of points for summoning minotaurs. I find it really lame when boss battles just summon other enemies to do their fighting for them. It's not a very good look. So that's why the Theseus ends this high in the list. For number 37, we have CALLISTO, Kratos' mother. Again, this wasn't really meant to be a full-on boss battle, but it was still memorable because it's just really dark what Zeus did to Kratos' mother. She told him the secret that Zeus was his father, and she turned to this monster and she attacked Kratos for a little bit, and then Kratos had to kill his mother. I'm putting it above Theseus because it has that emotional element to it that Theseus or none of the other ones had. So it's a meh boss battle, but you know, still somewhat memorable. For number 36, we have the Persian King. I really remember this boss fight because it's the first enemy we fight from another pantheon, and I thought it was gonna be cooler. But the reason he ends up this high in the list is because he's just really easy. I like his patterns, and I like all of his moves and all that, but he was just a really easy boss fight. He attacks you with his sword a little bit, and then he summons the spirit of the Ifrit, but other than that, he's just a really easy boss fight, which makes sense because he's an intro boss battle, but I wish he would have gotten a few more moves. For number 35, we have the PIRAEUS Lions. I'm sorry if I'm mispronouncing that, but he's the lion you find in the prisons in Ghost of Sparta. And the reason this lion is way better than the mole Cerberus is because he's a completely new enemy. He's got different moves, different patterns, but he's still very easy to take down, so that's why he ends up this high in the list. For number 34, we have Grendels of the Frost and the Ashes. The Trolls of God of War 4. This topic is so controversial because Cory Barlog has said before that the Trolls are not really boss fights. The only reason people confuse them as boss fights is because they have a health bar and they have a little bit more lore to them, right? But if you really think about it, they're more like the Cyclops, only better. But I can see some of these trolls like fitting the places of bosses. God of War 4 did not have a lot of bosses, so they ended up putting a lot of trolls in it. Now, Grendel of the Frost and the Ashes. This encounter is cool because you have to balance out the fight between the two. One attacks with fire and the other attacks with ice, so you have to change your weapons. You have to use the Blades of Chaos for the Frost one and the Leviathan Axe for the Fire one. It's an interesting mechanic, but it gets better later on. For number 33, we have the Bridge Keeper. Another troll. I promise this is the last one. I'm not gonna count the other ones because they're just way too similar. The reason I'm adding the Bridge Keeper is because he actually, I do feel like he took the place of a boss fight, which was going to be the Bird in Helheim. Now, the Santa Monica didn't have enough time to create that boss fight, so instead they put the troll in there. The reason I'm adding him is because he does have a few new moves, like he's got those floating souls that attack Kratos, and he can also disappear, which makes for an interesting mechanic. But again, it's another troll. I'm not expecting much. For number 32, I have ALECTO and TISIPHONE. You guys know my opinion on God of War Ascension. If you haven't, I'd recommend you watch this video. But bottom line, I do not like that game very much, especially the boss fights. ALECTO and TISIPHONE are easily the worst final boss fight in the entire series. I always see the final boss fight as something that has to be personal to Kratos or the protagonist. In this fight, ALECTO turns into a frickin' kraken. Sure, it's got spectacles and she does a few cool patterns and all that, and Kratos gets to use all of his items at the end, but it just wasn't very memorable at the end. All of the other final boss fights feel personal to Kratos. This one just didn't. It was just disappointing. For number 31, I have POLLUX and CASTOR. This is another boss fight that's kinda meh. His main ability is to slow down time, but that just really makes the fight really annoying. He's just a very forgettable character. I mean, both of them are. He's got a really cool detail that when you hit him, he turns old, because you're damaging the power that the amulet is giving off. So it's a cool detail, but mechanics-wise, the boss fight is not really memorable. At some point, he gets on these pillars and you have to break them and then throw rocks at him. It's not very fun. For number 30, I have Perseus. I really want to love this boss fight, but sadly, I just think it's a little bit too easy. The thing I love the most about this boss fight is that in the first stage, Perseus actually turns invisible, and you have to look at his footsteps on the water to determine where he is. It's a really cool mechanic, and I honestly think this boss fight would have been higher up in the list if that was all you were doing in the boss fight. But you can beat him really easily. That's its main weakness. For number 29, we have Hermes. Hermes is another one of those boss battles that's not really a boss battle. The first stage of it is you just chasing him around Olympus, which is really cool. It's really scripted, but it's cool nonetheless. Then you meet him up close, and then you fight him with your Blades of Exile and your other weapons, and then you weaken him enough, and then you get to rip off his legs to use the boots, which is the most memorable part in the entire fight. It's a fun interaction with one of the gods of Olympus, but as a boss battle, it lacks complexity. 28, we have Charon. Charon is another one of those enemies it's a solid boss fight, but the character itself is not that memorable. That's all I can say about Charon. He's very forgettable, but the boss fight itself was decent, and it's really hard on the hardest difficulty, by the way. For number 27, I have Persephone. And much like Charon, Persephone is a character that I really enjoyed, and the boss battle itself was decent, but it just didn't have that wow factor to it. And maybe that's because the game's released for the PSP, and the PSP wasn't able to handle those wow moments like in God of War 3 or in God of War 2. Now, I'm not expecting Persephone to turn into a frickin' Kraken like God of War Ascension, but there's just nothing really special to the fight. There is that cool moment where Atlas intervenes, and you get the explanation of how Atlas ended up holding the world on his shoulders. That is cool itself, but the mechanics of the boss fight are good, just okay, I guess. For number 26, I have Scorpius. Once again, I'm in the minority here. I don't think Scorpius is the worst boss battle in the series, and I have to commend Santa Monica Studios for trying to innovate the boss fight, because Scorpius is the only boss battle that requires Kratos to use another set of weapons other than the Blades of Exile. You have to use the Nemean Cestus to break the ice from his legs, and then weaken him, and then do this quick time event in which you break his back and then stab him with his own... Oh, I don't know what that's called. The thing the Scorpion has. You know what, let's move on. Number 25 is MAGERA and TISIPHONE. MAGERA and TISIPHONE is the boss battle in God of War Ascension that has the best mechanics in my opinion. The reason I say this is because I like seeing them tag team against Kratos. At one point, MAGERA picks up Kratos and slams him to the ground, while TISIPHONE sends her magical bird to slam him against the wall. It gives us really cool interactions like those. It kind of reminds me of Thor, Iron Man, and Captain America at the end of Endgame. But the main complaint I have with the fight is that you don't get to kill any one of them. When you think you did, it turns out to be an illusion by TISIPHONE herself. So that's the main disappointing part about the boss fight. If it wasn't for that, it would have been much higher in the list. For number 24, I have HECATONCHIRES, and I think HECATONCHIRES is both good and bad. The reason I think he's bad is because he's not really the same HECATONCHIRES we hear of in Greek mythology. In Greek mythology, HECATONCHIRES had like 100 hands and 50 heads or something like that. In this game, they turned them into a bug. And I think it's because they just didn't have the capabilities with the PlayStation 3 to animate 100 hands or anything like that. But it felt kind of cheap. But the boss fight itself is pretty good. It's got all that spectacle intro boss fights in the God of War series have. And even at the end, you get to control one of the bugs and kill another bug with it. It's kind of ridiculous, but fun at the same time. For 23, I have the Basalisk, the intro boss fight of Chains of Olympus. And I really have to commend Ready at Dawn for creating this boss fight, because I know it couldn't have been easy given the capabilities of the PSP. But damn it, they did put a huge boss fight in that game, and it was pretty good. It's not as good as other ones, but it was decent, man. For number 22, I have EURYALE, and I know she's not that important to the story. She's a very forgettable character, but I think the boss fight itself is really fun. She has really cool patterns that the player has to learn. I love the one where she clings to the pillars and she tries to freeze you with a wave of Medusa power, and if you are caught jumping, you are gonna be immediately dead. She also has a few ground pounds. All of her moves are really fun. She's got that tail swing that you have to jump and avoid it. It's a classic boss fight, and I love it. Again, the character herself is very forgettable. She's not that important to the story, but I think the mechanics of the boss fight are pretty fun. For number 21, I decided to go with ERINYS. ERINYS makes it this high on the list because of the second stage of the boss fight. Now, the first stage is pretty good. She turns into a bird, and you have to take her down, and then she turns back into her more human form, and you have to fight her. It's pretty good. But the second stage it's really memorable, because Ready at Dawn pretty much took the same idea from the Chain of Olympus in God of War 3 and made it part of the boss fight. Essentially, ERINYS is flying in her demon bird form, and Kratos is chasing after her. But you have to avoid her projectiles to get close enough to her and then just hit her up close. That part itself was very memorable, and I wish it would have been implemented in more boss fights because it was a really fun section. For number 20, I decided to go with CLOTHO, and I'm surprised with the God of War community for not mentioning her as one of the better boss fights, because in my opinion she is. The reason I say that is because she's a boss fight slash puzzle. Now, the first stage is the puzzle part, in which you have to trap her arms in doors and harpoons and all that, and that section is really fun. And then the other half is the boss fight itself, where you meet her up there in the Loom of Fates and you fight her. She's got like really long reaching arms that can get you from pretty much anywhere in the arena, so you have to bring this blade that's used to cut the threads of time and stab her on the face with it. The character itself is somewhat forgettable, but the mechanics of the boss fight were really memorable in my opinion. For number 19, we have the Kraken. The Kraken is another one of those boss fights that's also a puzzle section. The first part, you have to use the dead body of the Spartan and put it on a pressure plate to release steam and then fly up to his head and then hit him and weaken him. That part itself is pretty fun, and the mechanics are really fun and all that. But I'm gonna be honest with you guys. The reason I put the Kraken this high in the list is because I like the way in which we finish him. He pretty much like ends up like hanging onto the edge of the Temple of the Fates, and you pull on this lever and you kill him with the bridge. Execution wise, that does not get any better than that. For number 18, I have the Barbarian King, and I gotta be honest, the first time I played God of War 2, this boss fight came as a complete surprise to me. Because in God of War 1, it tells us the story of how the Barbarian King died, so I wasn't really expecting him to come back again. But essentially, he comes back in a zombie form with a fiery horse. In the first stage of the fight, you have to take him down from the horse. Now, this is somewhat difficult because he's using his bow and arrows to keep Kratos at a distance. So you also have to use your bow and arrow to take him down, weaken him, take him down, and then the actual fight begins. And he's a pretty formidable foe. Like, he can disappear out of nowhere, slam you with this freaking huge hammer, and later on he can actually turn giant, which makes it for a really challenging part. Now, the reason he also makes it this high on the list is because he's the only boss fight that features a cameo from the ship captain, and that obviously gives him some points. But the Barbarian King is a really fun boss fight. For the number 17 spot, we have Zeus from God of War 2. Now, I really want to put this boss fight in the top 5 category, but there is a reason why I'm not doing that. Good things about this boss fight is the mechanics. You start off the fight with Zeus being a giant, and you have to use the sirens to weaken him. Now, once you suck his power essentially with the Blade of Olympus, then the fight continues, and Zeus and Kratos pretty much keep like changing weapons. Like they both want the Blade of Olympus. So gameplay wise, they have to take the Blade of Olympus from their hands and fight each other until Zeus is completely weakened. And then you do this super cool quick time event, and that's my main complaint. You don't get to kill Zeus. Now, this works for God of War 2 because I love the cliffhanger as well, but it's a shame that you couldn't kill Zeus at the end. Obviously, the other Zeus fight is going to be a lot more memorable, but more on that later. For number 16, I have Magni and Modi. This is another boss fight that fans don't really talk about too much, but I think it's one of the better ones when it comes to two enemies fighting Kratos. I love the chemistry between Magni and Modi. That cutscene at the beginning is just amazing when Magni's all like, "Surrender, the old father demands it," and Kratos is like, "No," and then they both split up to fight either Kratos or Atreus. It's just a really fun boss fight. I will say though that if you play on normal, it's not gonna be as fun as it would have been if you played on a harder difficulty. Maybe not Give Me God of War, but maybe play it on Give Me a Challenge. Then you'll really enjoy the boss fight. For number 15, we have Poseidon, and boy oh boy, this is one of the best intro boss fights in all of gaming, I would have to say. It does not suffer the same issue HECATONCHIRES did with God of War Ascension. Santa Monica did really go for it. They're like, oh no, God of War 2 ended with Kratos going up to Mount Olympus, and we're gonna deliver. So it was this huge battle between titans and gods, and you could see Hades fighting in the background, and then Poseidon just suddenly jumps from Mount Olympus into the ocean and turns into this huge water monster with crabs and horses, and Kratos has to fight through all of them. And then later on, you actually break through his watery chest, and then you get to poke his eyes and then just break his neck. It's such an amazing intro fight. I was only 15 years old when I fought Poseidon for the first time, and I can honestly say that I'm still amazed with this boss fight as I was all of those years back. Now, I will have to say though that the reason this is not so high up in the list, the boss fight itself lacks a little bit of mechanics, but it makes it here because of the spectacle. Like, the spectacle is just amazing. The camera work, all of it, it just works, man. It's honestly one of the best intros for a game. For the number 14, I decided to go with the Mountain Dragon. I'm not even going to try and pronounce his name. But yeah, when this game came out, a lot of people complained that God of War 2018 didn't have enough big boss battles, and I would have to agree with them, but I have to say that Santa Monica did an amazing job when it came with this dragon boss fight, because it's got the spectacle from Poseidon, maybe not as much, but it also has the mechanics. Essentially, you have to throw these exploding sap balls to his mouth, and then they explode. This weakens him, and then it gives you a window to attack him. Now, you have to do this multiple times, and at the end, Atreus actually comes in to help. He shoots down the hook, Kratos like stabs him in the eye or something, and then he finishes him off in a very Kratos way. It's honestly a really satisfying boss fight, and I wish I'd see more of that in the future. And at number 13, we have the Hydra, the boss battle that started it all. If I'm honest with you guys, this is the boss battle that made me fall in love with this series. Ever since I was a kid, I loved the idea of a small character fighting a huge monster. And God of War was the first game in which I experienced that. I had never seen this level of scale before. The first time you're just walking through the ship and suddenly this big ass snake head just breaks through the walls of the ship and you have to fight it, and I thought the graphics were simply amazing. And then you fight the bigger head, but you have to trap the smaller ones with what I think are anchors, and then you move on to the big head, and you grab it with your Blades of Chaos, and you pull it through the mast of the ship. It was just spectacle after spectacle. It was simply amazing, and to this day still is. For the number 12 spot, we have the Colossus of Rhodes, the intro boss fight for God of War 2. Now, I did not think back in 2007 that Santa Monica was going to be able to top themselves with the Hydra, but damn it, they did it with this boss fight. Again, it lacks mechanics per se, it's mostly about spectacle. But who cares? That's all you remember about the fight. Like, you're just walking through these hallways, and then the Colossus suddenly just breaks through with his hand, and then the same with his leg, and then you have to take the Blade of Olympus and break through his stomach, get inside, get rid of all of his energy, and then come out victorious. It was just spectacle after spectacle. And again, I get it, there's not that much mechanics, but it's a boss fight that I'll always remember for the rest of my life. For number 11, I have Thanatos, the God of the Dead. Now, I'm not gonna spend too much time on why I like this boss battle so much. I'm gonna get right to the point. Years before Atreus came into the scene, Kratos didn't really have an ally to fight by its side. This changed with Ghost of Sparta. Final fight against Thanatos, Deimos came to our side. Kratos gave him the arms of Sparta, and Deimos fought by our side. Now, it was really cool because it wasn't just him fighting by himself. Sometimes the player would have to press the down D-pad button, and Deimos would throw a spear or just attack him, and you would see these cool tag team moves between Kratos and Deimos that would just make it for a really memorable fight. And also, I cannot forget the moment when Thanatos actually killed Deimos, and Kratos went all rage mode and just destroyed the hell out of Thanatos. Bottom line, the Thanatos fight was both epic and emotional. Okay, so we finally made it to the top 10 God of War bosses of all time, at least in my opinion. And the number 10 spot would have to go to the Stranger, otherwise known as Baldur. Now, the reason I love this boss battle so much, first of all, is the setup. Like, this guy just comes knocking on Kratos' door, and he's just looking for a challenge. Kratos tells him, "Leave my home," and Kratos just punches him, and then Baldur uppercuts him, and Kratos realizes the strength of this puny-looking god. And then the fight begins, and when the fight begins, they just destroy the entire terrain. It reminds me of those DC battles between Superman or Darkseid. Like, they're just destroying trees, freaking opening up the earth in half. It's crazy, man. There's also a moment in which you think you actually beat Baldur, but he actually throws an actual Baldur at you. So yeah, the destruction of the level, and also the context, I forgot to mention that. Like, all throughout you get dialogue, these little dialogues that are so important. Like, he tells you, "I can't feel anything," or "I'm not like my brother." I never really thought about dialogue in a boss fight as much as I did in this one, but it's really important. It's not higher because it's not as difficult as other boss fights, and that's understandable. This is the intro fight of a new game in the series, but I wish there was a little bit more challenge. For the number 9 spot, I have the Minotaur Guardian. Now, the reason the Minotaur Guardian makes it so high in the list is because it also has a puzzle component, much like the CLOTHO fight from God of War 2. And I really wish more boss fights in the future include a puzzle component to it, because it makes it all the more enjoyable to defeat the boss. In the Minotaur Guardian, you're not just hitting him until he dies. You actually have to weaken him, go to the ballista a few times and break his armor, and then you can actually kill him. Like, it's got steps and it feels like a puzzle, so it's more enjoyable once the player actually figures out what he has to do. Now, speaking of how you end the fight, I have to say that it's one of the most memorable finishers in all of the series, because it doesn't really involve a quick time event. You weaken him finally, and then you go to the ballista, and then you nail him to the freaking wall. For the number 8 spot, I have CRONOS, and I have to say that CRONOS was my number 1 pick of all the boss battles from the God of War series for the longest time. But lately I've been reconsidering this because CRONOS feels a little bit more like a level, but he's also a being, so he finds himself in a gray area when it comes to what is a boss, what is a level. So he's both, and he's just amazing, let's just say that. So CRONOS is the biggest enemy I think I've ever killed in a video game. Maybe the Colossus from Shadow of the Colossus are up there as well. But CRONOS, from the moment you start, you have to use all of your abilities that you've learned so far. You start by blinding him with the head of Helios, and then you make your way up the giant, and at times you have to break his nail. And there's this really cool moment where he goes to like squish Kratos, and you have to look at the shadow of his hand and then get in between his fingers. It's just moments like that is what make God of War 3 so enjoyable. The Gaia and Poseidon fight was very well done, but Santa Monica put all their efforts into CRONOS, and it shows, man. I really wish more games in the series included these Titan mechanics, because fighting Cronos was just a really memorable moment. Now, my main complaint is that this fight or level just feels a little bit too scripted. It's more like tiny areas in which you have to defeat the boss in a certain way. He doesn't really have a health bar, so that's why it feels a little bit more like level. Again, I would love to put this fight at number 1, but again, it feels a little bit too much like level. But hell, it's one of the most memorable moments in the entire series, hands down. For the number 7 spot, I have Hades, and honestly, there's not much I can say about Hades. He's just a really good boss fight, and a boss fight that you'll have to play in order to understand what I mean. There's not much spectacle going into it. It's just Hades with a bunch of mechanics and patterns that the player has to learn in order to defeat him. First of all, the fight starts off with him trying to take your soul away from you, which is just really cool. Then he's got a bunch of moves. He can bring out Cerberus. He's got like long swings with his blades that you have to jump through. He's got an energy wave that you also have to jump through. He's got a lot of patterns that the player has to learn on the fly, and that's what makes the boss battle so enjoyable. Now, there is a second stage in which it becomes a little bit more about scale. He turns giant, and Kratos actually takes his claws from him, and he has to use them to defeat him. And you actually use the claws of Hades to take the soul of Hades, which just makes it really enjoyable. Honestly, this boss fight, you will have to play it by yourself to know what I mean. It's a really, really good boss fight. For the number 6, we have Sigrun, and much like Hades, I don't really have to say much about Sigrun. Everybody watching this video knows that Sigrun is freaking difficult. There's zero spectacle to it. It's all about difficulty and learning her patterns. The first time I fought her, I think I started fighting her at 12 AM and I finished at 3. It took me 3 hours to actually beat her. But that's the thing, every time I died, I kept coming back for more because I loved learning all of her patterns, and after defeating her, it was very rewarding. I would have to say it's one of the most rewarding things I've ever done in any video game. For the number 5 spot, I have Hercules, and I'm gonna have to apologize because it seems like I'm repeating myself a lot. But the reason I love the Hercules boss fight so much is because it's all about patterns and mechanics. God of War 3 really improved on that, and Hercules is a really good example of this. You start off the fight by fighting a group of enemies. Hercules gets tired, so he puts on his Nemean cestus and comes down to fight the ghost of Sparta, and then the fight is on. Once again, you're just not beating him until he dies. You actually have to weaken him and carry him to these walls with thorns on it to take parts of his armors off. This way he becomes more weak. By the second stage, you can actually take his Nemean cestus, and the fight continues on. You would think he would be weaker by then, but he actually pulls these wrestling moves and tries to break Kratos' spine. Honestly, it's just a really well done fight. And of course, I cannot forget how the fight ends. Kratos takes his Nemean cestus and beats his face to a pulp, and then he falls into the sewers and dies completely. Beautiful. For the number 4 spot, I decided to go with the final fight against Baldur. I believe one of the best things God of War 2018 does is its inclusion of the story and gameplay. By the time I got to the final battle, I cared about all of the characters involved in the fight, which kept me on the edge of my seat. The only thing standing in the way for Kratos and Atreus is Baldur, who has just become vulnerable to death, and Freya, who has slightly turned against us and is using the dead body of a giant to protect her son. With this setting, we get what I believe to be the best boss fight of God of War 2018. You as the player have to use all of the skills you've learned up to that point, dodging, parrying, switching between weapons, to actually damage Baldur, using Atreus for support, you name it, all of the abilities you've learned. And by the end of the fight, the game rewards you with a glimpse at how much of a fighter Atreus has become. For the number 3 spot, I went with Ares, the original God of War. And I'm somewhat sad because I never hear God of War fans praising this fight as much as they should. Kratos starts the fight by opening Pandora's box and turning into a giant. What follows after is a fight that every God of War fan probably remembers. First of all, Ares opens a mythological black hole and sends Kratos to a realm in which he has to fight other Kratoses to defend his family. This part is so difficult. I've tried to finish this game on the hardest difficulty, but this section always beats me. Next, Ares takes away Kratos' blades and brings him out for an execution, but Kratos uses his Spartan training and picks up a bridge in the shape of a sword to fight Ares. Now what follows after is a really interesting gimmick for a boss fight, as both Ares and Kratos share a single health bar. The way to beat Ares is by not getting hit back. You have to hit him and take his health for yourself, leaving him completely empty, kinda like a tug of war game. This doesn't sound too difficult, but believe me, trying to do this with no magic or a higher difficulty will keep you busy for hours. For the number 2 spot, we have Zeus from God of War 3. And as I always do in every playthrough of this game on a live stream, I'm gonna make you listen to this part and then we'll talk about the fight. Just listen to this part and get hyped. So yeah, this fight starts off with that little tune, dun, 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 and then the fight begins. This fight is just simply amazing. Fans waited so many years after God of War 2 to fight Zeus, and Santa Monica delivered with this fight. The fight can be divided into 3 sections. The first is a 2D perspective that would later be an arena in Mortal Kombat 9. The second section takes place outside of Mount Olympus. This fight doesn't last too long as Gaia intervenes, leaving Kratos and Zeus to find a safer place to fight, which would be inside of Gaia. The third section is obviously the most fun, as you see Zeus attacking Kratos with all of his powers. He's got projectiles and he can summon clones of himself. And you as the player have to deal with all of these attacks while the real Zeus tries to heal himself by stealing the health from Gaia's heart. What follows after is one of the best quick time events in the entire series. Kratos pushing Zeus with the Blade of Olympus towards Gaia's heart in order to kill them both. I didn't think Santa Monica was going to be able to deliver with another Zeus fight after doing the one in God of War 2, but damn it, they did it. And for the number 1 spot, we have none other than the Sisters of Fate from God of War 2. This fight shines in all levels: music, story, scale, mechanics, all of them. Once again, this fight can be divided into 3 sections. The first one is just against Lachesis to learn her patterns and also getting some practice with the grapple hooks in the arena. Next you fight Atropos, which actually takes you to the past in order to erase Kratos from existence. She attempts to destroy the sword Kratos used to defeat Ares during the events of God of War 1. So you as the player have to prevent her from doing so. Failure to do so will result in one of the coolest cutscenes in the series, which has Ares killing Kratos in the past. But to be honest, this section is not too difficult. You'll probably have to let Atropos kill you on purpose if you want to see it. Or, you know, go to YouTube and watch the cutscene. But once again, the most fun section is the last. As Kratos returns to the future, he has to fight both Lachesis and Atropos in their temple. In order to defeat Lachesis, you'll have to use the grapple hooks around the arena to actually take her down. Once she's down, you have to attack Atropos, trap her inside the mirror, and break it in order to succeed. You'll have to do this a few times until you trap both sisters inside a mirror, leaving you to break it however you please. And because I'm a bit of a psychopath, I like to take my time before I erase them from existence. In all honesty, if you haven't played God of War 2, you totally should because that game is a masterpiece. But honestly, just buy it for this boss fight. This is gonna be worth it. Just play it. Just play it. Just play it. So there you have it, guys, my official ranking of all the God of War bosses, or at least I think that's all of them. Make sure to make fun of me in the comment section below if I missed at least one of them. I'm sure I didn't, but you never know. Anyway, if you want, you can let me know your official ranking in the comment section below, but I would prefer it if you just left me your top 10 instead. As always, I want to thank all of my members for their monthly support of the channel. People like The Gamer, Jamie Harris, and Akito Denka, to name a few, are the main reason I'm still able to upload these videos. So from the bottom of my heart, thank you. I would also like to thank all of the people who like and share my videos. It doesn't seem like much, but it really does help the channel. And with that said, don't forget to subscribe for more God of War content, and as always remember, go forth in the name of Ragnarok.